Hello, I hope everyone is having a great Monday or whatever day you're watching this. It's Monday right now, the 9th. We are getting close to Thanksgiving, to the holiday season approaching. It is getting later in the semester. We are close to the end of the semester, close to our final week, week 13. So hang in there. You just turned in your first assignment and you have a couple more until the end of the semester. But we are making our way there. I hope that for all of you, as we're halfway through the semester, that you all are handling your course load and life in general well at this time during this insane pandemic and adjusting to online classes. I know a few of you have emailed me and told me that online is confusing and you're still adjusting, so I completely understand that. But I hope in general, most of you are adapting pretty well, okay? All right, so today I want to talk about visual rhetoric and a couple reasons for doing this. I have a couple reasons of doing this. One, a lot of the messages that we're bombarded with contain a visual element, and I don't want you to think of rhetoric as only written or spoken word. Visuals can be rhetorical, and we'll talk about the definition of visual rhetoric here in a minute. But and mostly, a large percentage of the messages that you receive, the information you're getting, is by visuals, whether it's a magazine or Facebook or a billboard or a television show. You're bombarded with a lot of visuals that convey significant rhetorical meaning, significant information, significant meaning, okay? So it's important to be able to read images like you would read a text, okay? And for that reason, I want to talk about visual rhetoric today and spend the entire lecture today speaking about that. Secondly, and probably what you're most concerned with, is that films have a visual element to them. And just like I was assigned as a freshman at the University of Texas a film rhetorical analysis, I really value that assignment, and I am going to, as if you've already looked at, hopefully most of you have read the syllabus, you know that I've assigned you a film rhetorical analysis as well. I think it's a pretty effective, useful assignment to utilize all the skills that we've learned in the course so far up to this point, and that will be your final assignment, is that film rhetorical analysis. I used to assign a visual rhetorical analysis and a film rhetorical analysis, but since this semester is so crazy, I am sort of lightening the reading, lightening the assignments that you have to do, so that you'll turn in less assignments and do less reading, to make it easier on you because of the transition to the online format, and because we are all dealing with issues outside of the classroom, outside of school, the visual classroom, and outside of school that are pretty trying during this time. So I want to be understanding of that, myself included. Okay? But the learning about, so you won't have that assignment comparing two different visuals for their use of rhetoric, but you will be expected in this film rhetorical analysis, and I will be looking for when I grade them coming up. I know that you won't have to turn in your second assignment until the 13th, so I'm looking ahead a little bit. And as it gets closer to time to turn in your film rhetorical analysis, we will talk specifically about visuals in film. But for now, I want to talk about visuals in general, because this will really help you. When you do your film rhetorical analysis, you will be expected to explain, to understand, and to evaluate how shots in a film convey messages rhetorically, how visuals are used for their rhetorical effect in a film, how the director uses visuals in a film to convey rhetorical meaning, okay, to convey a message. All right. So visuals can make use of rhetorical devices as well. A visual can be metaphorical. A visual can be an illusion, and visual can be many of these different things that you think of as literary devices or rhetorical devices can appear in the visual format as well. Okay? So let's get started talking about visual rhetoric. It's a branch of rhetorical studies concerned with the persuasive use of images. And maybe the best way for you all to think about it now is memes. They are a great example of rhetoric, primarily because you have to already have certain information to be able to understand the meme. If you don't, then you're left outside of this circle of communication. So you have to have certain knowledge to be able to understand what a meme is conveying and the humors. Second would be a political cartoon. I'm sure that you have seen so many political cartoons depicting the policies of both presidential candidates, and they make use of rhetoric. They are inherently rhetorical. So pay more attention to them when you see them, memes, and there's still some political cartoons floating around even though the election is over. Pay attention to those and try to start to decode them with the information that you'll gain in this lecture. All right? So visual rhetoric is the study of the branch of rhetoric concerned with the visual and the persuasive use of visuals, the persuasive techniques of visuals, okay? Persuasive use of images, whether on their own or sometimes accompanied by text, right? Sometimes visuals accompany text, like on a billboard and other advertisements, okay? So words, I want you to think about a text is visual in itself, right? The words are organized in such a way that it is either visually appealing and concise or not, right? The words on a website sometimes are, the background is a certain color, right? The way the text appears is rhetorical in itself. Before you even read the words, the way the text appears is rhetorical in itself. It can convey, this is artistic, this is serious and businesslike. It conveys a certain tone, the way the text even appears, okay? So words gathered on a page have a visual aspect of their own, but they may also interact with non-discursive images such as drawings, paintings, photograph, or moving pictures. Advertisements, for instance, almost always contain some sort of visual to promote a product. That's probably one of the best examples. And for the visual rhetorical analysis, I did have students look at advertisements. We won't be doing that this semester, but it's very useful because advertisers are always constantly bombarding you, trying to persuade you, convince you to buy their product, right? So to be able to really evaluate the product's claims to decide whether it's worth buying or not, you need to be able to read the visual that they are promoting. Okay? All right. Well, not every visual image is rhetorical, just like not every everything is art. Not every visual is art. A visual object can turn into a communicative artifact or a symbol that communicates and can be studied as rhetoric with the presence of three characteristics. So I want you to kind of evaluate any image for these three certain characteristics. And one is that it's symbolic, that it makes use of symbolism. That is a literary device and a rhetorical device that's used when you're talking about only a written or spoken word text that you're looking at, but also applies to visuals. So the image must be symbolic, and it must also involve human intervention, meaning that it's a creation of a human mind. And it must be presented to the audience for the purpose of communicating with that audience, meaning that the author, the creator of the visual, had a purpose for communicating with an audience in mind when they created the visual. Okay? All right. It's almost impossible to miss visual rhetoric in politics, of course. I think most of us, when we think, like I was speaking about the very first lecture, talking about what is rhetoric, most of us, if we only have a little idea of what it is, think of politicians for their use of rhetoric, because they're often called upon to make speeches and to convince their audience to vote for them, or to convince their audience to adopt their policies or endorse their bill or act, whatever it is, pass it through Congress, right? And it's kind of gotten a bad rhetoric has gotten a bad reputation because of that, because sometimes politicians use words that are empty, and so rhetoric has come to mean empty words, making promises that they don't fulfill, words that sound good but ultimately are not delivered upon. Okay, so it's easy to dismiss visual rhetoric that has a political message. It's easy to dismiss it as spectacle, right? Opportunities for entertainment rather than engagement. But because visual images transfix us so readily, and I want to pause here and speak a little bit about the difference between the effect of rhetoric when you're reading it on a page and the effect of rhetoric when you see it visually. If we look at an image, and if we have the information to understand what a meme or a visual is communicating, we understand it immediately. We don't have to look for very long at the image to understand the message. We grasp it instinctively and immediately. Whereas with a written text, we might have to read that paragraph 3 or 4 times for understanding and read the entire article twice. But the effect of a visual rhetoric is much more immediate. So I want you to keep that in mind as we're talking about visual rhetoric. What makes it that much more immediate and effective in that way? We see it and we grasp it within seconds instinctually, whereas it takes a little while longer for words to kind of sink into our brains and the effect to take over, right? So keep that in mind, okay? So when I'm talking about politics, even the decision of a presidential candidate to wear white, Kamala Harris in her acceptance speech wore an all-white pantsuit, and AOC has been known for wearing an all-white pantsuit, and that is symbolic. So go look up the symbolism, why these women in politics have decided most recently this year to wear all white, and what that means. Traditionally, white has been kind of the color of purity, right? And we wear white on women wear white on wedding days to symbolize their purity. And it has certain religious undertones too, right? So think about that meaning of white, and then go look up why women in politics have recently decided to begin to wear all white, and what they hope that rhetorically that image will affect in their audience, okay? And the message they're trying to convey to their audience in that way, all right? So even the decision to wear an American flag pin on the part of a politician is rhetorical, right? It sends a message of patriotic devotion, right? And It's just a little pin on their lapel. But it's a visual that conveys devotion to this country and patriotism to the audience. All right? Just like the wearing of certain colors conveys certain things. Black conveys, we wear black as a sign of mourning. Okay? And when white is a sign of purity. Okay. The way that politicians grab photo opportunities, take advantage of photo opportunities. They are so cliche for kissing babies that it's become a political cliche. They want to be known as, politicians want to be known as endorsing family and being a family person themselves. And so they will go out and kiss babies so that you know that they are an empathetic individual that cares for children, right? These are values that we all hold dear, caring for children. And so they want to be seen in that light instead of a political bully, right? Okay. So these are some examples of how politicians take advantage of visual rhetoric, right? Visual rhetoric and advertising. We could go, there could be a whole class on this, but I just want to speak real briefly about it for the purposes of this course this semester. It's predominantly, advertising is predominantly a strategy of visual rhetoric to persuade the audience to buy what it's selling, or whatever the company is selling. It employs strategies of identification. You want to identify with the company and with the product on a personal level, right? It's also dominated by appeals to gender. And you can see that when you just walk down the toy aisle. You can see that it's separated into sort of black and blue for the boys' toys and then pink and purple for the girls' toys. And color is one way to make an appeal to gender, but you can see that advertising is predominantly, even visually, makes use of appeals to gender as a primary marker of consumer identity. They want to identify with their consumer base in that way, and appeals to gender, or visual appeals to gender, is one significant strategy that advertisers use. All right? Okay. Now, a little bit more about what visual rhetoric is. First of all, I want to speak about the different filters that visual rhetoric has to make its way through in your brain before you make meaning of it, and decide upon what the visual actually means to you. There's color, there's the layout of a visual, there are shapes that are used, there's typography or the font, there is images of nature, images of, on the opposite spectrum, architecture, right? That's what's actually there. That's the visual input that you're seeing. Colors and shapes and fonts. That's actually what you're seeing. But it is filtered through a contextual filter comprised of your life experience, timing, just simply meaning the time in your life when you witness the visual, when you come into contact with the visual, your level of education, the culture that you were raised in and exposed to, even the language that you speak, the certain media that you witness the visual on, view the visual on, the genre, so whether it's an advertisement or whether it's a movie, whatever genre the visual appears in, and your expectations. We have expectations about what visuals are intended to accomplish. We have expectations about how visuals work. And we have expectations before we see the visual about what we expect to see. And so sometimes those authors of visual text, authors of visual artifacts will play with those expectations in interesting ways to grab the viewer's attention. Okay? Then they are filtered through a kind of a persuasive filter before making it to the brain. Reason, emotion, and credibility. So this is ethos, pathos, and logos, right? We evaluate kind of subconsciously this visual for its logic. How logical is this visual? Is the argument that this visual is making? And remember, visuals can make arguments. Does this visual appeal to my emotions? How does it make me feel? And ethos. Is the author of this visual credible? Is the visual credible itself? Do I believe what it's telling me? All right. And then finally it makes its way to the brain, right? So a little bit more about what visual rhetoric really is. Visual rhetoric is a part of communication where we interpret and make meaning out of the world around us. Rhetoric helps us to do that, but visual rhetoric helps us to do that with images. In other words, visual rhetoric is a space where communication takes place, a space that is affected by complex variables, a lot of different variables, as is rhetoric in general. Aristotle's definition of what rhetoric is includes the word observing, which is seeing. Observing, in any case, the available means of persuasion. So it has sort of a visual aspect to it in itself. And that is the original definition of rhetoric. In other words, if you want to persuade someone to think or act in a certain way, you have to choose appropriate words, organization, style, framing, and so forth to convince them. With visual rhetoric, you choose a visual means of persuading. If you design a website, for example, which might be the most common, applicable to our own lives, a lot of us have blogs or websites, personal websites. It's very conceivable that you might want to design one. Some of you have been asked to design one for classes already. And some of you, a lot of you, I'm betting, already have personal websites. So the colors, the layout, the style of the site that you choose, people will interpret it a certain way, and that will affect whether they see and interpret your website as being something fun, boring, worthwhile, credible, or a waste of their time. They make an impression based on what they see before they begin to read the words on your website, and they're already, by the style, colors, layout, affected to feel a certain way about what they are encountering on your website, okay? The problem is sometimes we communicate visually without even realizing it. And this isn't sometimes, this is the majority of the time. I love words. I teach writing. I am a literature PhD. I love words, right? But the fact is that in the study of communication, very little of it is actually verbal. Communication between people is something around 80 to 90%. I would have to, officially look up a good source, but I've read this from many sources over several different, several years. I've encountered this information, been told this information from several different sources over the years, that the majority, something to 80, 90% of communication is non-verbal, is visual, is by what we see and interpret on our own, right? So that makes visual rhetoric even more important when you are simply just communicating with family and friends. I speak about this every semester, but it's even more important now that we have less face-to-face communication than ever before in human history. Those verbal cues, I think with Facebook, we do most of our communication online, and we miss out on the visual and verbal cues, and predominantly texting and online through social media. And so we miss out on sort of those visual cues. that are 90% of communication. And I feel like perhaps humanity, perhaps humans are starting to kind of lose the ability to read those visual cues and to communicate with each other face to face. Even dating is done online now. But now we're sort of kind of forced to communicate via FaceTime. And some of this face-to-face communication is lost. A lot of the message gets lost in translation when there is less and less face-to-face communication. Okay, something to think about, something interesting to think about. Okay, so we communicate without even realizing it. We communicate a lot of information visually without even realizing it, without even doing it on purpose. I know that authors of a visual text, authors of a written text, we talk about the author's purpose, but sometimes we create a visual text unintentionally, a visual message, visual rhetoric, communicate it visually, unintentionally, without necessarily a conscious purpose. Okay? And we're always constantly, every time we look at anything, being persuaded by a whole host of things: color, design, fonts, and so forth. Even what you're wearing communicates visually. Before someone meets you, someone makes a decision based on what you're wearing, what kind of person you are. So even clothing can be really rhetorical. It communicates a lot of information. Your clothing says something to your audience about your age, your gender, your social status, your financial situation, your personality, and I bet you could come up with more to add to the list. But your clothing communicates quite a bit of information. For instance, I'm wearing a blazer now and a blouse. It's not real silk, but it's kind of a silky kind of material. It's like silk. It is a blouse that is definitely work attire, professional attire, work attire, and a blazer, which professors, college instructors are notorious. It's kind of our uniform, wearing a blazer. So I would communicate professionalism and, some kind of professional status. If you hadn't met me and were, before we had spoken, you would make some kind of inference about my attire and how it conveys that I am a professional, have some professional status, okay? All right. So a lot of the choices we make a lot of what we convey when we choose to get dressed in the morning is intentional. You want to give off a certain impression of yourself, but some of it isn't always, okay? The fact is that visual rhetoric, or the way people interpret messages by what they see, is affected by a whole host of things. And you can see, talking about those contextual filters, those are some of the host of things in ways that visual, and I'll post that it's a graphic. I will post that graphic of the filters, the contextual filters that visual rhetoric makes its way through to your brain on Blackboard under course materials later. But those are just a few of the host of things that affect how the audience interprets visuals, how we as humans interpret visuals, okay? Those contextual filters, color, how effective those visuals are at persuading us to believe or not believe, okay? In other words, context plays a huge, huge role in interpreting visuals. If I look at American flag, I am an American, I am 36, and I am female. So if I look at an American flag, it means something very, very, very different. Or if a 50-year-old American male looks at an American flag, it means something very, very different than if a 16-year-old Japanese girl who just immigrated looks at a flag. That's context. So it will mean different things, different values and beliefs will be conveyed when that 16-year-old teenage Japanese girl looks at the American flag than the values and beliefs that come to mind when I view an American flag. Okay? So that's a really good example of how context works. So how does visual rhetoric work? How does visual rhetoric work? Whenever we look at anything, visual rhetoric is in play. Even as you're, viewing this video, you're thinking about my backdrop, you're thinking about what I'm wearing, deciding whether to listen to what I have to say or not. We look at things and we're designed to kind of subconsciously make judgments about them. And our judgments that we make really rather unconsciously, kind of snap judgments. Our judgments that we make are a result of our past experience, our education, our age, life experience, socioeconomic background, sexual preference, religious beliefs, on and on and on and on, right? Gender, the list goes on. All of those different aspects of our life that make us who we are identifiers, affect the judgments that we make when we encounter visuals and the meaning that we make out once we do encounter those visuals, okay? Our judgments are also affected by timing, depending on where we are, what stage of life we're in at that point in time. Life experience can suddenly make a movie that seemed pretty harmless before kind of offensive, given gained life experience, okay? Everything that you see around you right now has been designed, consciously designed to look a certain way. Your computer, your desk, your clothes, your website, your pen, all of those designs say something to you personally. Fun, cheap, ugly, any number of adjectives that you could come up with to describe what you're viewing. What you determine the design means to you is affected by anything from your personal taste to the expectations you have of what a computer should look like, what a desk should look like, what anything should look like, okay? Internally, after making these judgments, you determine 3 things about what you see. If it's credible, how it makes you feel, and if it makes sense, okay? So when you're analyzing the visual portion of the film for your visual rhetorical film analysis, you want to speak about how the visual is credible, how the visual makes you feel, and if it makes sense, and what kind of sense the author, the director, wants you to make of the visual. And if it was effective, or if you made completely different sense of the visual. Does it make sense to you? Or is the meaning kind of lost? The director's meaning kind of lost in you because it doesn't make logical sense. How does it make you feel? Is that how the director wanted you to feel? For example, we'll get more into film rhetorical analysis later, as I said. Okay? This, of course, is known as the rhetorical triangle: ethos, pathos, and logos. After evaluating the visual for its ethical, moral, logical, and emotional impact, you will come to a conclusion about it and make up some kind of meaning, okay? So if you log onto a website and it's poorly designed, your aesthetic judgment of what websites look like over years of viewing websites will come into play. You might also have a little bit of understanding about how easy a website is to navigate. You're not going to spend a lot of time on a website if it's not very easy to navigate, and this affects your interpretation of design, okay? You might determine quickly that the website is incredible because it's not very easy to navigate. It will make you feel annoyed, and you may determine that logically its design doesn't make any sense and the content doesn't make any sense because of that, okay? And the website was not worth your time. That's visual rhetoric at work. All right, so what is not visual rhetoric? What is not visual rhetoric? You could argue, that everything we view is rhetorical, that everything must be rhetorical, but we want to talk about some kind of criteria. Is a tree or a rock an example of visual rhetoric, right? Things that are there. Remember, one of the criteria was human intervention, so you might be inclined to say no answering that question. The short answer is perhaps. The tree makes you feel a certain way, and they do communicate a level of beauty and aestheticism. an aesthetic preference. Reminds us of nature, right? Does a chair or a building count? Sure, a building may look scary and persuade us not to enter. Or a building may look old and persuade us that this business is failing, right? But rhetoric, really, we're talking about that element of human intervention. We're really interested about rhetoric that occurs, visual rhetoric that occurs when something is intended. Someone creates a visual that is intended to communicate a certain message, like in an advertisement or a report, okay? However you interpret it, visual rhetoric is at the root of communication. It's very important to communication. We see everything before we understand it. With the exception of music and sound, we see everything, even words, before we understand it. And that's why it is so incredibly important in our making sense of our world. So why should you care about visual rhetoric? Whether you've thought about it or not, you create visual things all the time. Every time you write a report, or if we're not talking about the visual world, or the business world, every time you turn in a paper, right? That's rhetorical. It's organized in a certain way. Every time you write a report, you're making choices about the typography, font size, spacing, headings, and even colors. Even if you stick to the defaults in Microsoft Word, that is still communicating a choice. And is still communicating your knowledge of design. By consistently sticking to the defaults, it may convey that you do not know much about design, or that you're less creative, or that you have not put in much effort into messing with the design, or into creating a specific design for a specific purpose, okay? Your resume is inundated with visual rhetoric. I believe I read something that employers spend about 30 seconds looking at the resume before they either toss it into the pile to look at further, or toss it into the pile of people that they don't really want to consider for the job. So you've got that much time to make kind of an impact. And that impact is not only made by words or the information on the resume, but by the design, right? Okay? Employers spend about 30 seconds on a resume. They need to be persuaded first by how it looks to read the information that it contains, all right? How you design the things in your life and how you interpret visual rhetoric and the messages, visual messages that you encounter in your life says a lot about you, even if you don't realize it, okay? The more you recognize available means are most appropriate, the available means which are most appropriate in any given situation, the more the visual rhetoric will work in your favor. Okay. So I want to talk about now how to analyze visuals, okay? Because quite a bit, the entire film that you analyze will have a visual component for the entire hour and a half or however long your film is, right? It is visual media. So I want to talk about, and we'll go over specifically how to analyze a film, but for now I want to talk about specifically how to analyze the visual component of it, okay? Analyzing a visual artifact. It could be, a billboard, a painting, an advertisement, any of these visual artifacts, right, that we've been speaking about. What a visual analysis really requires you to think about is what that artifact's role in society is and the impact that it has or will have on viewers. I'm kind of driven to or compelled to think about, I drive home to Texas. My family lives in Texas, so the holidays and mostly the holidays, I drive 14 hours by myself to Texas, and I have to pass through Missouri. And Their billboards are an interesting study in rhetoric. They have quite a few, I would say at least 20, just on this one highway making my way through to Texas. Billboards concerning arguments against abortion. And of course, they include a visual component, pictures of adorable infants, and sonograms and things like this. But I am absolutely compelled to think about, that's what comes to mind, visual rhetoric when we're talking about billboards. And you want to, that would be great. That would be a great example for visual analysis to think about what role that billboard plays in society and the impact it will have on its viewers driving down the highway. The context is you're driving down the highway in rural Missouri. What kind of impact will it have on the audience? Who is the audience, right? Who's traveling that highway? What kind of ideas and beliefs do they have in that part of the country, in that part of the state? On and on and on. So that's kind of a striking example that stands out to me that I'm compelled to think about. All right, so when you're doing a visual analysis, you want to choose a visual artifact, not just any visual artifact, but one that has meaning and purpose and is intriguing. You want to research the artifact to understand its context, meaning who created it, why, when, how, right? All those questions that the journalist asks. I haven't had any classes in journalism, but if you've had a writing class at all, then you know the 5 W's, right? Who, what, when, where, why. So ask those questions about the visual artifact, okay, to understand its context. Evaluate the rhetorical devices. It can be color. It can be several different rhetorical devices, right? Color is one that's most often used, quite often used. Evaluate the rhetorical devices used to affect the audience. How effective are they? Why choose this particular rhetorical device, given this particular visual format, given the particular topic, given the particular audience, given the particular situation? Okay. Examine the design principles, the use of color, the use of formatting. Examine the design principles. Formatting, shapes, colors, font, those are all design principles, okay? And we're not going to get into, we're not studying for a degree in graphic arts, so we're not going to get into really complicated design principles, but just a few would include those that we've already talked about today. Font, shapes, colors. Another thing I'll mention that's really important, what is in front of the visual? What appears right in front? What is your eye drawn to? A principle of graphic design that you don't have to be a graphic artist to understand is that your eye is drawn towards some part of the visual first, some aspect of the visual first. So what draws your eye first? Why? Why did the author choose to compose the visual that way? What gets the most attention? You'll look at a lot of companies have made a very concerted effort to be inclusive, gender inclusive, racially inclusive, and in terms of disability as well. So their ads will feature disabled individuals, members of the LGBT community, and individuals of different races. But you always want to look at who is in front. A lot of the Barbie ads that I see show Barbie with all different kinds of shapes and sizes and different skin colors and even different abilities, Barbie in a wheelchair. But most often blonde skinny Barbie is still in front and center, still the primary focus, because she is the Barbie that's existed since the 1950s, okay? And that's just one example. By the way, toys are great for visual rhetorical analysis. Children's toys kind of influence gender, ideas about gender, ideas about body type, and disability as well, and race. Toys are notorious for doing that as we are children, and interacting with these visuals and interacting with toys. They reinforce ideas about gender and race and ability and disability. Okay, so something interesting to think about if any of you have kids already, or just as you're at Walmart walking down the toy aisle, something interesting to think about, or even think back to the toys that you used to play with. Okay, perfect, really rich example for visual rhetoric. Okay. Then after you look at all those different sort of elements of design and context, and identify the rhetorical devices used, then you want to evaluate the visual for its overall effectiveness and come to some kind of conclusion based on your analysis. Okay. Often, what makes for the best visual rhetorical analysis is choosing a visual that is overtly controversial. In class, I have previously, when we were doing our rhetorical analysis over advertisements, I have chosen some that kind of made a stir. There are some fast food joints like Burger King that show women in bikinis eating hamburgers when you know that woman has never eaten a hamburger in her life. But aside from that being controversial, the woman's body type and the clothing, aside from that being controversial, mostly it is the connection between the two desires, the desire for sex and the desire for food, those two human drives, that is controversial. Okay. But other ads can be controversial for a reason. Liquor companies and cigarette companies have been in a lot of trouble for targeting younger audiences under the age of 21 that are too young to buy either product, be getting into a lot of trouble. And I'm sure that you can think of several ads that have been controversial for different reasons, but those are some that pop up in my mind that I have previously kind of showcased in the classroom before. Okay? Picking an ad that's controversial, picking a visual that's controversial means that there's going to be plenty to say about it. All right? Those racy images make statements and convey something about our values regarding sex, specifically in that Burger King ad. It's kind of old now, so I might need to update my examples. That ad appeared with Paris Hilton early 2000s, so kind of shows my age there a little bit. Okay, so here's your process. When you're choosing an artifact, when looking at a visual, you want to keep in mind it needs to be something you're interested in, something that makes a social, cultural, historical, or political impact. Not all visuals make a really specific, significant impact, okay? And one that you can research. Graffiti is rhetorical. Of course, traditional art is rhetorical. I just want to mention something about the two different types of audiences. They're both considered art, right? But one is high art. And so a traditional Van Gogh painting, your audience is going to be different because it's going to be the type of people who can afford to visit museums and have the education to, or at least, you assume that the type of audience for a painting like that is someone higher class, cultured, someone interested in the arts, someone of a higher socioeconomic status, as compared to graffiti, which is found on the streets and not in museums. A different kind of audience, a younger audience, and an audience of a different socioeconomic status. So they're just right there, the context is different. So what each artwork has to say will be different because for that reason, what kind of audience is the visual artifact is trying to reach, okay? Marketing campaigns, and political campaigns. Spaces like buildings and landscapes. okay, are all visually, rhetorically significant. You want to make sure that that level of human intervention is present, that your artifact is human design, not something just found in nature. So to consider the context that the visual artifact was created in, you want to consider the who, what, where, when, and why. The who. We'll start with the who. Who was the creator of the visual? And just like, this is exactly like when we were talking about a visual analysis of a text, or a rhetorical analysis of a text. You want to get some understanding of the author's values and beliefs by getting an idea of who they are. Educational background, professional background, socioeconomic status, gender, age. All of this goes into creating, all of this goes into influencing the author of the visuals' values and beliefs, and their kind of subject position, their view on the world, their worldview, right? Who is the creator? Is it an individual? Is it a group? Is it a corporation? I'll remind you that groups and corporations also have values and beliefs. Okay, and they're organized for specific reasons. What else has the author created? What other works has the author created? Who did the author create the visual for, and who is affected by it? Who's affected by it? What do you know about the creator's background, including, like I was just speaking about, including heritage, so race, education, status, mission, and so forth. Gender, age, religion, political beliefs, socioeconomic status. All of these things go into, contribute to the author's formation of their values and beliefs, okay? What is it? What kind of an artifact is it? What genre or category would you label it as? Of course, for our purposes, film. What seems to be the creator's attitude toward the subject? In the visual, you can tell what the author's attitude is toward the subject. What do you know? What makes it special or important? What impact has it had? And if it's a historical artifact, or even if it's recently been released, you can kind of gauge the public reception to it. What kind of stir has it created? What kind of a reception did it get in the public, in the general public, okay? What makes it special and important? What impact has it had? What is the artifact made out of? Wood, stone, plaster, and what is included in it? Images, colors, shapes, text. And I want to point out one other really important thing. And that is, just as we sort of have blinders, we have a certain perspective. And we can only see from our perspective until we broaden that perspective. The visual has a frame too. Our perspective is framed by our life experience. And the visual's perspective is framed by the author's perspective, right? So the visual cannot continue on infinitely. It is framed. You know, if it's an 8x8 photograph, then it's framed by 8x8 literal frame, right? An actual physical frame. When you see something on the news, it's framed by the camera lens. You have to imagine that the camera lens isn't there and that you're zooming out to get to see what wasn't captured in the frame. How does that change your perspective? How does that change how you understand the visual? Right? You can edit a frame any way you want to include information or disclude information, okay? Something important to keep in mind. So imagine that the frame, that you zoom out and the frame is widened. What are you seeing that you didn't see before that helps you understand, okay? So what's included and what's not included? All right. Where was the artifact originally constructed? Where was the artifact intended to be viewed, and where was it actually viewed? Where might the artifact be viewed in the future? When was the artifact created? So now we're to where and when. When was the artifact created? What other historical and cultural events were occurring at the same time period that sort of guided its creation? When did the artifact have its greatest significance? When might it again have significance? Okay, so there are social, political, and cultural factors occurring at the time of the visual artifact's creation that spur on or are the impetus for its creation, that compel the author to create that visual. So what socially, culturally, historically, and politically is going on at the time period that contribute to the creation of this text, that surround the creation of this text, right? Visuals are not created in a vacuum. So how did social, cultural, political, economic conditions at the time influence the creation of this text and influence the author? Okay. And finally, why? Why was the artifact created? To make a profit, deliver a message, change perception, and influence, educate? Why did or does the artifact affect its viewers? Why should we care about the artifact? Okay. Consider the credibility of the artifact. Ethos. What makes it believable and trustworthy? Does it follow ethical guidelines? Is it well designed or poorly constructed? Who created it? Who supports it or uses it? That's ethos. Pathos. Does the artifact employ devices, colors, images, or words that cause an emotional reaction to it? Are those devices cultural, historical, political, or idiosyncratic? What specific emotions are meant to be evoked by the artifact? And is the artifact successful at evoking those emotions in its audience? And logos, finally. What kind of logic or reason is behind the artifact, behind the argument that the artifact is making, the visual is making, that influences the audience's interpretation of it? Is there an argument being made? Are there facts, statistics, or historical references present, either implicitly or explicitly, meaning hidden or overt? Remember, as we talked about, one of the most important elements in the effectiveness of a rhetorical artifact, whether it's visual or written or spoken, kairos, which is the appropriate time and appropriate place and the appropriate message, right? Right time, right place, right message. Kairos. Was the artifact created and displayed at the opportune moment for it to have the opportune effect, the maximum effect? If it had been presented at another time and place, would it have been as effective? How would its effect have changed? More or less? Would it mean the same thing? Of course not, because the context has changed depending on time period. And depending on politics and society and culture. Topos, meaning the topic. How does this artifact fit in with other artifacts that have tackled the same issue of its kind and other artifacts of the same kind? Does it follow convention? Does it look like you would expect it to look, or does it play with conventions of visual rhetoric? Does it alter them and break them in interesting ways to have an effect on the audience, a rhetorical effect on the audience? Does it adhere to expectations, the expectations you have of visual? Okay. Remember to consider the design elements that we talked about without being a graphic designer. Typography, so font, color, shapes, contrast, light and dark. The alignment of different elements of the visual. And the focus of the visual. Those are the few most important, okay? Then you will want to develop your own argument about the visual artifact's impact by having an opinion. You should have something to say about it after analyzing all those elements of the visual. How does it make people think, feel, and react? How does it contribute to or reflect upon society's values and beliefs? So write your opinion down, and that will be your thesis statement. Organize your thought. Have a logical sequence of arguments that supports your interpretation of the visual. Your main thesis should be developed by a series of smaller sub-arguments like any essay, like any argument, with clear transition statements so that you're walking your reader through. Okay? All right. So that's a little bit about how to construct a visual analysis, visual rhetorical analysis. We will talk more about visuals specifically and rhetorical devices specifically as they pertain to film when we get closer to actually having to write and turn in our film rhetorical analysis toward the end of the semester. But for now, that's an introduction to visual rhetoric. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and I will see you all next week.